So welcome to this Belbin webinar, where we will be looking at your Belbin reports to ensure that you are getting all that you can out of the report and to ensure that you're using it to help your self-development, your self-awareness, and to understand where to make that best contribution within a team. So, as an individual, let's go on to these individual reports. Why on earth would you bother? Well, been for a little bit of the reasons. But obviously this is going to help your self-development, your learning, your self-awareness, help you to learn where and when, timing is key, to make your best contribution. Understand how others see you. My goodness, this is all about a growth mindset, isn't it? It's saying that actually how I am now isn't necessarily who I'm going to be in 5 years. Let's grow and see how I can develop my strengths. And also learn how to be a strong example. So strengthen those strengths and manage your weaknesses. Don't just settle for being a high-ish plant. See if you can get into over the 80th percentile. But we'll talk about that in a second. Right, so that's a bit of background. Get your reports out ready. We're going to go back now to here. So, you've filled in your self-perception inventory. You've got your observer feedback. Your report is in front of you and you're thinking, what on earth do I do now? What's really important to understand with these Belbin individual reports is each page tells a different part of the story. It looks at you from a slightly different perspective. So to use a page by itself is only going to give you a limited amount of information. So we start here with the team role overview. This is page 1. This is all of the available information all put together. And it's going to give you an idea of how you feel about each of those team roles. Obviously, if you have observers, it will include the observers there. Remember, you need a minimum of 4 observer assessments for this updated report. We don't provide it on fewer than 4 due to the fact that we feel it could be slightly biased, and we don't want that. We want it to be a fair reflection. As you see here, we're looking at percentiles. And what is a percentile? Well, there's all well and good saying that you score a certain amount for each team role, but does that matter unless you compare that with the general population? If everybody else scores the same as you, it's in no great shakes. So we need to know how you compare against a norm database. So hence we put everything as a percentile. So as we can see here with Sam, Sam is virtually at the 90th percentile for implementer. And that means that only 10% of the population scores higher than Sam for that particular team role. Similarly, if you look at plant, you can see that Sam, let's say that's the 5th percentile for plant. That means that 95% of the population scores higher than Sam for that. What is this population database that we use? Well, we look at this on a regular basis. We are currently using a database of 9,500. This is an international database, but it is mainly English speaking. There are equal-ish male to female. I think it's 51 to 49%. What we do is that we do look at this on a regular basis, and when we feel that there is statistical significant change, we will change that norm database because the world changes, and we want to ensure that you're being measured not on people who perhaps attended a training course in Henley in 1968, but actually the current database, at least in this millennia, would be great, which it is, and we check this on a regular basis. So the next page is really one that people can get hung up on, and this is because you're really now including how other people see you, and this is where it gets really fascinating. So that top line there is looking at how Sam sees themselves in order of preference from top number 1 to bottom number 9. So Sam order, his ranked order here is implementer, monitor, evaluator, specialist, coordinator, completer, finisher, shaper, team worker, resource investigator, and plant. Then we have the feedback from the people that Sam has decided to ask to observe them. And you can see here that the top one here is that Chris has observed monitor, evaluator, specialist, implementer, team worker, so on and so forth. You can read those out. So what does this mean? Well, first and foremost, it is only giving you a ranked order. So remember, it's not saying how much of that team role that person is seeing you, but only the order in which they're seeing the team roles. Why is this important? Well, actually, you could get hung up on a position and say, well, actually, somebody else has seen that team role on third, where somebody else has seen it as fourth. And it could just be that there's 1 or 2 percentile difference there. So we don't want to get too hung up. But what we can see here is patterns. We can, if you use a bit of paper and just cover them all up apart from the top 3, so columns 1, 2 and 3, you can start to see if there's any patterns emerging. Then extend it out to number 4 as well. See where the similarities are. But what do you need to ask yourself at this point? One of the key things I would say is question who you ask to observe you. What is their relationship with you? Are you their manager, or do they manage you? When did they work with you? How long have they worked with you? So ask these questions and you will suddenly think, oh, now that makes sense. One other question to ask is, what do you think the main team roles, strengths of the people who have observed you are? So if somebody is a really high plant, for example, are they going to see and value your plant behaviour as much? Or are they going to see and value other behaviour that they don't have more often? So there's lots of questions to ask here. Then what we have is that last line, the observer overall views, looks at all of the observers and it combines a very complicated formula, an overall line. And then we look at the overall line for the observers. We look at your line as well at the top there for how you saw yourself. And we come up with an overall team role composition. Now at this point, people normally ask the influence each observer has on the overall, because it's something that people are usually quite interested in. So if you say that the self-perception is equal to 1, each observer is equal to 1/3. So if you had 3 observers, you'd have 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 would equal 1. So the combined weighting of 3 observers together would be equal to the self-perception weighting when they were put together to give your overall team role composition. Now, obviously, we can't produce a report with 3. So when you have a report with 4 observers, the observers are slightly outweighing the effects of the self-perception inventory by 1/3. If you have 6 observers, what we have there is 1/3 times 6, which is 2. And so the observers are twice as influential as the self-perception inventory. What happens if you have more observers? We'll actually keep that 2-to-1 ratio, but the effect of each individual observer just goes down. So the first page is analysis of your team or composition will tell you the ranking of each of the team roles. What we need to therefore do is then look at this next page, which is comparing self and observer perceptions. And this page is showing the combined observers compared to the self-perception inventory. And what you're looking at here is to see where the differences and where the similarities are. So one thing I will say here is you very rarely get exact. I don't think even, and we have pretty coherent profiles here in the Belbin office, and even we don't have it exact, there is always some variance because we have different relationships with people, and again, their team roles also come into play a little as well. But what questions do you need to ask? Well, you need to ask yourself, or if you're feeding this back to somebody else, why do you think they see something different to you? Why do you think, Sam, that others don't quite see as high influence as you? And did you know, Sam, that you had a hidden strength? Is in fact your teamwork is something that people that you've asked to observe you really value and really expect you to bring to the team. Can you think of why that may be? So what we're doing here is not saying, no, actually you're wrong, they see something else. It's what you're saying is, my goodness, people are seeing strengths in you that you never had, you never realised you had, if there's a big difference. And just lots of open questions to ask is, why do you think they're seeing you slightly differently? Why do you think they see your strengths in a different way? Ask the questions, when did you last make that contribution? How well do you think that contribution was accepted by everybody else? With Belbin, generally, this isn't a case of getting your ruler out and looking at the millimetres. It is a case of really getting a feel for what that graph is telling you. But if you did want to look at that, we do have those numbers at the bottom in the key. And this is something, again, if you were looking at using this as a self-development tool, it's something you can go back to. Is, you know, back in 2012, actually my observers collectively only saw this amount of implementer in me, but I've been working on that recently because I know that it was really needed, and so has that increased. So this is where, you know, a bit of your cholesterol check comes in. So this is fascinating stuff, because this is really finding out how other people see you, and it is asking yourselves those open questions, the who, the why, the whens, etc. We now come off looking at your observers. So you will have this if you've just got your self-perception inventory. And this page is just looking at you, where you think your preferred roles are, where you think your manageable roles are, and your least preferred roles. As we were saying before, if you have a flat profile, you'll find most crosses in that manageable role part of the report. Very few people can do, in fact, I don't know if anybody can play all 9 team roles brilliantly. So what we want to do is really identify those ones with the help of others to find which ones we can develop. The next page is the go and have a cup of tea and have a good read page, because this isn't something that you're necessarily going to want people to read if you are feeding back, I don't know, on a training course or as part of a workshop, for example. This is the so what page, and this page started many years ago, 30 years ago, with Nigel Belbin and Meredith Belbin and some of the team who were involved in the Henley work. And they, Nigel would say, right, so if you had these two as your top team role and this is your bottom team role, what advice would you give them? You know, from all of your experience, what would you like to tell them? And they pressed sort of play and record on the tape player at the same time, and so these reports began. We're now on our 7th version. We've changed some of the language so it's more accessible. But basically this report is based on your top 3 team roles and your bottom team role. Now, if your top team role is head and shoulders above anything else, it will actually just be on your top 2 team roles and your bottom team roles. Team role, singular, obviously. So this is really looking at each end of the spectrum, and it's going to give you advice on how to project yourself, how to manage, how to be managed, and also where you should go and find somebody who has strengths where you really do not, how to be more effective. Have a good read of this. There's some wonderful advice in here. The next page we have called Maximising Your Potential. This is looking at what we would call trigger points. So it's saying very much if you're over a certain percentile for this team role, over a certain percentile for that team role, and below a certain percentile for another team role, it's going to generate these particular trigger points. And this is what makes the Belbin report so unique. It's not saying that you could have the same team role profile as somebody else, but you will have different things written in your report. Because it's looking at not just your top roles, it's looking at how much of those top roles. This report is really unique to yourself. So you have your strengths and you have your weaknesses. What you will find is that there will never be more weaknesses than strengths, because we want people to obviously have a positive experience with this particular page. If you're looking at projecting yourselves, if you're looking at interviews and things like that, these are great things to be able to talk about when people say, what are your strengths and your weaknesses? I mean, obviously you need to build them into a paragraph or two when you're explaining them, but these really can be used so that people understand how best to use your contributions. Now, it could be that you don't agree with your observers. It could be that you don't think that they see some of your team role contributions as much as they should. And in that case, what we've got here under the understanding your contribution based on your self-perception part of this page is that we do have advice on how to play that particular team role how to strengthen the way that you play that role so other people can see it. Again, there's lots of different sentences that come out depending on where you allocated your marks for that particular team role within the self-perception. So again, there's a lot of difference there. But this is great for coaching one-to-one. Okay, people aren't seeing what you want them to see. What can you do about it? Okay, let's go through this. How can you play your implementer role with great better effect? Right, next page. Now this is very much an interesting one. It's one that is for your manager, really. It's one that I would use to sit down with my manager if I was looking at a coaching session or some feedback, not necessarily an appraisal, but when you should be having your regular one-to-one catch-ups with people. It's really going to give an indication as to what work and what working environment you are best placed. Now, again, another story that I heard from one of our distributors, because we have an amazing network of distributors worldwide, is they were working with an organisation and they said, these are all really interesting, but how do we use them? You know, how do we make sure they don't just go back into that top drawer? And so they decided to each make 2 copies of their reports, and they gave one to their line manager, which they had monthly one-to-one catch-ups. And they used their report, and particularly this page, so that they could check that they were being given work that matched their strengths. And they used this really as a way of starting and continuing that conversation is, you know, how well are you doing at the moment? Well, actually, I'm finding that you're giving me work that isn't, really isn't, can't think of the word now. Isn't that awful when that happens? But it basically isn't playing to my strength. That's easy, isn't it? And so they use this to be able to say, well, okay, then what work would you, what sort of environment would you best be suited for? Let's try and find that kind of work for you. Okay, now we're going to come to 2 pages, which I always like to use together. So I'm going to put them both up. These 2 pages are just looking at your observers. And it's just looking at which words were ticked and how many times, which is on the right-hand side there. And then whether or not they were picking up on the strengths of each team role or the allowable weaknesses or both, and how much of each were they picking up on. What we have to remember here on the observer team role strengths and weaknesses is each bar is a bar in its own right. So what it's trying to do is to give you a proportion of the weaknesses people are seeing compared to the strengths that people are seeing for each particular team role. Here, I would say this is an absolutely healthy graph. You would expect people to see weaknesses. In fact, one could argue that if you have nothing on your associated weakness area of this page, you need to be a little bit worried because people either aren't seeing them or you're hiding them. Everybody has these weaknesses. We've worked with companies that have said, can we not allow people to tick list B? When you have your observer assessments, you have list A, which are all the words that are related to the strengths of the particular team role, and you have a list B of words which are related to the allowable weaknesses. And those list B words you can see on that page list of observer responses are all in italics. So you can identify which are list A and list B words. And some companies have asked us, we are not ticking any list B. We do not want any negatives, which is a real shame because sometimes when we manage and manipulate our negatives too much, sometimes we lose the corresponding strength as well. Now, when we look at the list of observer responses, as we know, if you cannot tell which words your observers have ticked, but what you can work out is if you had 4 observers here, as Sam does, if for diplomatic, Sam had 8, we would know that everybody had given that a double tick, and therefore that means that the anonymity of the observers has been slightly compromised. So that is the only way that would happen, or obviously if it was 7, you'd know that everybody had at least given it 1 tick, in fact everybody had given it a double apart from 1. So we need just to be a little bit careful there. One would argue, obviously, that if everybody's giving it a double tick, it's quite obvious that you do show that. Again, it's these words that really bring the team role report you've got here to life, because You may have somebody who's a really high shaper, who is a really high monitor evaluator, who has teamwork really at the bottom of their profile, but they could have caring or helpful at the top of this list. And my God, that's telling you quite a lot that may not be coming out in terms of the team roles, because they haven't got any of those other attributes of team worker. But to know that you're dealing with somebody who's a helpful shaper, monitor, evaluator, now that is useful information to have. And again, that's what makes these Belbin reports so unique. By the way, these words are ones that you, if you are looking to project yourselves perhaps at interviewing, it could be internal, external. These words are ones that I would suggest using, along with the strengths and weaknesses on those other pages, because these are different to the norm of I am a great team player and I communicate well. These are ones that are really showing you. This is what other people are saying about you. This isn't you bigging yourself up. These are the people that you're working with, identifying and telling you where your strengths lie. This is also the page where you can again go back to your cholesterol check. Perhaps you were quite a high coordinator, but you wanted one of those words, conscious of priorities, to go up high. You wanted people to really see that as an area of coordinating you wanted to work on. Again, you can see whether it's rising up the ranks there. Next page, last page. Here we have the suggested work styles, and what this is doing, it is looking at your top 4 team roles, and it's looking at a combination, because we're not just one. I think going through the report, it really does emphasise, doesn't it, the point that we're not a plant, a resource investigator. We are a wonderful mix of all of these 9 team roles. And this is looking at your top 4, and it was putting the first 2 together, then the first and third together, the first and fourth, and the second and the third team roles together, and saying in combination, what kind of work would you best be suited towards? And again, I think this is a great one to sit down with a manager. Also sit down, if you've all got this page, if everybody within the team, and of course that's the idea, isn't it? If everybody in the team has got this page, when you have got a project in front of you, and you know your objectives, you know your timescales, and all of that has been worked out, and you're saying, right now, work needs to be done. Who is best at each stage here? These are great pages to all have in front of you, because Sam needs to be included in the planning. Not only are they going to make sure that everything is very organised and systematic, they're also going to make sure that the right decision is there. But you don't perhaps want Sam to be at the idea stage, because I can't see any resource investigator plant there. So who else has got that on that sheet of paper around them in the team? So this is a great practical one to use to ensure that work is being allocated to the right person. So we've come to the end there of a real step-by-step, what is each report trying to tell you. So thank you. If you've got any questions, please do get in contact with us, team@belbin.com.